Carlos Tanner, it's an honor to have you with me here today. Thank you so much for taking the time out to talk to me. You're one of the pioneers of the ayahuasca industry, and I'll let you talk about that yourself, but I wanted to preface this all by saying that I really appreciate your particular approach to the science of spirituality, also your focus on the crisis of purpose that is afflicting the modern culture. Addressing that with plant medicine is one of the most important issue that we can possibly address at the current juncture in human history. So do you want to introduce yourself and talk about your role with the Ayahuasca Foundation and how you got involved with ayahuasca in the first place?
Sure. Thanks again for inviting me to be on this show. It's a pleasure to talk to you. My name is Carlos Tanner. I'm 47 years old, and I am the director of the Ayahuasca Foundation, a nonprofit located outside of Iquitos, Peru. We've been operating now for 12 years, and the last 4 years, we've been collaborating with the British Medical Research Council, or more specifically, 3 doctors from the National Health Services in the UK, Simon Ruffle, Nigel Netzban, and Wai Feng Tsang, who have been conducting some really groundbreaking research that was recently published in the journal Frontiers in Psychiatry that showed that attending an ayahuasca retreat can have genetic changes and can produce epigenetic changes in expression of particular genes associated with depression, or more specifically, how we remember traumatic experiences. To me, the focus on trauma and its effect on us physiologically, emotionally, and mentally is the central focus of my observations on healing. And I look a lot at consciousness as a whole and how powerful our thoughts are and how powerful consciousness is. And the science of consciousness, I guess, would be the most important future endeavor for humankind. I think that ancient humankind, or our ancestral traditions of shamanism, recognize the power of consciousness, and shamanism as a whole was an effort to develop a science of consciousness. And ayahuasca is one of the last remaining intact forms of shamanism in all of our ancestry. But regardless of who we are, our ancestors relied on plant medicine for tens, if not 100,000 years for their well-being and to maintain their health as a community and individually. And so it's just a blessing to be able to continue to work with indigenous people in their indigenous traditions of that ancestral wisdom, and hopefully to find ways to bring it back into the modern culture, which, as you alluded to, is definitely lacking. And, I think there are some glaring holes in our understanding of the world, and especially our understanding of health in the modern medical paradigm. And we could learn a lot from understanding or studying more of our own ancestral paradigms as to how to better take care of ourselves on an individual level, but especially on a community and societal level. So that's what my passions are, and that's what I've dedicated my life to do. And I try to bridge those gaps between those paradigms so that greater understanding can be had.
Yeah, and I think that one of the reasons that ayahuasca is such a good tool is that, when systems are out of homeostasis, it seems like extremes are very common. So in our culture, we have this tendency to either become totally materialistic, deterministic, rational atheist, and then or swing all the way over to the other side of the pendulum and just sort of be so open-minded that wind is blowing through your ears. And a lot of new age culture, maybe a little bit too embracing of the woo. Shamans tend to navigate the spiritual waters and still keep their skepticism and down-to-earth, rational aspect of themselves intact, which is kind of a unique characteristic, I think, almost to shamanism. So one thing that I'm curious about is epigenetics. If you could talk a little bit more about that and how ayahuasca contributes to that kind of healing, and a little bit about what that process entails.
Yeah, well, I should preface that by the study I referenced was the first ever epigenetic study on any psychedelic, especially ayahuasca. So there isn't a lot of information regarding epigenetic changes brought about by the use of psychedelic substances or plant medicines. But epigenetics is a rather new field of medicine that references the expression of genes rather than the genes themselves. And it's kind of the superior understanding of genetics in the sense that, you know, we can all have the same genetics, or maybe a more specific answer, like, you know, two parents can have 4 children and all 4 of them, you know, have the same genetics, but only 2 of them express a hereditary illness. You know, why did those 2 express it, but not the other 2? And epigenetics is what really answers that, which suggests that while you may have genes, genes are not activated or deactivated unless there is something to do that. Now, usually what does that is an environmental trigger or an environmental action. And sometimes that can be, you know, some form of cultural conditioning. Sometimes it can be literally like an environmental influence, like a toxin, you know, in food or in their environment, like poisons or something of that nature. But sometimes it's an internal environment in your belief system, and that is what is most remarkable, because that means that we could actually have the power to activate or deactivate genes within us. And the book by Bruce Lipton, Biology of Belief, talks a lot about that, specifically about our own innate ability to deactivate or activate genes to express or stop the expression of particular characteristics or illnesses. And that was what happened in the study. People that had childhood trauma, they went through a healing retreat with ayahuasca at our center, the Ayahuasca Foundation. And at the end, when the genetic samples were collected again and analyzed, the expression of one particular gene, Sigmar1, is the name of that gene, which has already been associated with how traumatic memories are stored, was deactivated. And so that suggested a permanent like cure to their trauma, or at least an aspect of their trauma in the way that it was remembered, which ultimately refers to the reality, because our reality is essentially a collection of memories. And so that is pretty groundbreaking. It's kind of the future of our understanding of what genetics really means and how we can empower ourselves to have greater control, or at least greater influence over our genetics and how our genes are expressed. So it's fascinating, to say the least.
It is pretty incredible. It's kind of like a hardware upgrade, which I think people have a hard time. I think one of the things that's caused the most trouble for psychedelics in general to gain traction in the mainstream and to gain credibility is that the claims, people sound evangelical. You know, Dr. Timothy Leary in the 60s just sounded completely insane to people at the time. And the thing is, we're discovering, research is confirming that he wasn't wrong. You know, whether his approach to expressing that was sane or not is a subject of debate that we could continue. But, you know, overall, what he was saying was correct, that we could rewire our biocomputers. For example, addiction. The idea that you could give someone something like LSD or ayahuasca in order to treat a drug problem. I've been literally chased out of NA meetings for suggesting this. And I think that the type of research that you're doing, you know, it's another angle or another avenue of that same sort of idea of changing the actual wiring under the board, that we're actually re-imprinting the brain as if these traumas never occurred in the first place. And so I think that the miracle of these compounds like ayahuasca, you know, is that they are affecting change on so many levels And when we have the language to articulate how that happens from a neurochemical or biological Western standpoint, people can actually start to wrap their heads around why these things are so efficacious that, at first it sounds like a fairy tale. Dr. Humphrey Osmond, I think in the 1960s, said that we could cure every known neurological aberration with psychedelics. And, since then, we've had, I can't remember his name, the guy at Johns Hopkins, they were looking at psilocybin, and he said, it is simply unprecedented in the history of medicine that a substance can cure so many different psychological issues, oftentimes with a single dose. And so we get these like really effulgent, kind of over the top declarations of efficacy about these compounds. I think it's difficult for people to accept, but then when we're able to do this research like you're talking about with epigenetics and actually show people in biological reason why these things happen, it really does give us a lot of momentum. So I wanted to thank you for taking part in that, contributing and creating a platform and a space for that kind of work to happen, because I think it's really important. We have all of these levels that occur in an ayahuasca experience. The spiritual, you've been there many times, I'm sure, that the transcendental realm, the beings that you encounter, the geometries, it's all so surreal and transformative, just I think because you almost have to evolve in consciousness just to perceive what you're being confronted with. And then of course we have all these things happening on a neurophysiological level and genetic level, apparently. What about like physical healing with ayahuasca? Some people suggest that ayahuasca can cure cancer. I've had shamans tell me that that's ridiculous.
Yeah. It's certainly complicated. Like I mentioned before, there are two, what I would call very distinct paradigms. I'll call one the ancestral paradigm, the paradigm of reality from which all humankind came from. But in the last few hundred years, a new paradigm has been developed. You could call that a modern paradigm or the modern scientific paradigm. And while they overlap slightly, they're very, very distinct. And one key feature to that is that the modern paradigm from which most humans like you and me are operating in is very mechanistic, it's very materialistic. And so we are caught looking at medicine as a form of chemistry and a collection of chemical reactions. And we don't give very much credit at all to the process or to the consciousness element of it. Even though we recognize, because we have the term placebo effect, that consciousness could be the sole cause without any mechanistic process at work, meaning without any chemistry. A sugar pill, could heal someone if they believe the right beliefs. And that's what we refer to by the placebo effect. We don't really incorporate that into the Western medical paradigm. And so most of what you see with medicine is just take the medicine, and the medicine just does it on its own. Shamanism is very, very different from that. You don't just drink ayahuasca. In fact, far from it. No one just drinks ayahuasca in the indigenous culture. It's very important. It's beyond important. It's just essential that ayahuasca be taken in a ceremony. And beyond the ceremony is the ideologies and methodologies of the plant medicine tradition as a whole. And all of those play an incredibly important role, if not more important than the actual chemistry of the medicine being ingested. And that to me is the gift that we have the opportunity to learn from, and how to take what I believe to be a science of consciousness, that is shamanism, and incorporate it into our own systems so that we can benefit from the power of consciousness to work for our own good, our own well-being, in conjunction with taking medicines. And so, when you're talking about Timothy Leary, like LSD doesn't have a shamanic culture. There is no method of use. There's no ideology or methodologies associated with its taking. So people would just take LSD. But ayahuasca, there is a very, very powerful tradition developed over generations and generations, possibly over 10,000 years of experimentation and development of this science of consciousness to get to the point where working with ayahuasca, meaning a collaboration with our own consciousness and the consciousness of the plants in ceremony setting with all of the complexities of the ceremony procedures, and outside of that, the entire plant medicine tradition, that enables us to achieve those goals. And so that is, I think, a big challenge for us to understand, is that it's not just ayahuasca a substance, it's ayahuasca a tradition. And even the word tradition, I think, it isn't suffice to me. I think the word science really is better, because tradition means oftentimes it's considered to mean that it's the same way it's been done, when it's always in a state of evolution and development. So science it's acknowledged that it's always in a state of evolution and development, and therefore I would consider ayahuasca to be a science of consciousness enhancement towards mental well-being, physical well-being, emotional well-being, and spiritual well-being. So to answer your question, there was a documentary film shot in 2008 called Ayahuasca Diary that featured my first teacher, Don Juan Tangoa, who unfortunately just passed away last month, and myself, and a man from Los Angeles was participating in that documentary film, receiving treatment for cancer, and he was healed of cancer in less than 3 weeks. There was a follow-up, which proved, they showed the biopsy of his diagnosis before doing the retreat, as well as a biopsy after that showed that he was cancer-free. That was shot in 2008, 13 years ago. He's still cancer-free. So, I don't know how long you have to wait to decide that he was cured, but I think after 13 years, it's pretty safe to say that he was cured of cancer. But it wasn't ayahuasca that did it. It was the plant medicine tradition. Like I said, it was his own beliefs in collaboration with the methodologies and ideologies of the plant medicine tradition. And working with ayahuasca was a component of that. He also took other plant medicines outside of the ayahuasca ceremonies, which is also very important to note, that ayahuasca is not just something done by itself. In the plant medicine tradition, ayahuasca is a component, and albeit it's a central component, there are dozens and dozens of other plant treatments that work in collaboration. And so, for an example, on our simple 10-day retreat, there are 5 ayahuasca ceremonies every other day during that 10 days, but there's also a sangre de grado digestive system cleanse, a Chiricsanango central nervous system cleanse, Mukura, these are the names of the plants, Mukura sinus cleanse, Pinon Colorado circulatory system cleanse, vapor baths using 5 different plant medicines as a detox, plant baths, smoke baths with Palo Santo, sometimes with crocodile bones. There's a lot of plant medicines being taken, and anti-inflammatories using Gisador, which we would call turmeric, and other plants called Tanti Rao to increase sensitivity. There's a collection, like I said, of dozens of other plants that are always used in conjunction with ayahuasca. So it's never just like a singular plant treatment. It's always a collection of plant treatments. And that's just like a general treatment. Then if you were to get into cancer, for example, that man, Luis, who was cured of cancer in the documentary Ayahuasca Diary, he took a plant called Ohe, Ficus insipida, and that was a central part of his cleanse. He was also doing other plant remedies as well outside of the ceremonies, but so much of it was also his own belief system. And like I said, with reference to the placebo effect, like our consciousness is such a powerful element. And in some cases, our consciousness is the only thing that creates our healing. There was a famous study in Baylor University on orthoarthritis of the knee, where 2 surgical procedures were observed and studied to see which one was more effective for people that were suffering, some of them who were confined to wheelchairs. And the third control group was used in that study, where they performed fake surgery, where they, anesthetized the patients in the control group. They did create incisions, and then they played an audio tape of an actual surgery taking place, and then they sewed them up. So they did nothing, but the participants believed that they had had surgery, and they were up out of their wheelchairs playing basketball and walking and running, and nothing had happened except the change in their belief. So to me, like, we should be focusing all of our efforts on how do we work with this phenomenon that we recognize to be a truth, that consciousness is all that is needed to be healed. And we should be developing all of our medical programs based on that. Of course, there's very little profit in that, but and maybe that has something to do with it. That's a whole nother can of worms. But shamanism certainly does work with that, and that's why I feel like it's so effective.
The idea that a doctor would accept or even entertain the possibility that there could be some value in shamanism, or that these compounds could actually live up to the traditional reputation. It's kind of new that there are so many Western practitioners that are open to this idea. I saw an interview with an MD. I wish I could remember his name because he's a good person to follow, I think. And he's not coming from, a place of deep association with plant medicine and psychedelics. But after, I think it was just one ayahuasca experience, he actually said that he doesn't think that doctors should be allowed to treat patients unless they've had some kind of psychedelic experience. And he was dead serious. So I think that we're really making a lot of headway on all this. And I mean, you've sort of been tiptoeing around this, I guess, or implying it. There really is only consciousness. And this idea that the consciousness and light are somehow the fundamental reality. And so we need to focus on that as the foundation of our healing, because, that's all there really is. It's just that is the fundamental fabric. And so of course it can do all of the things that you're saying. It's really incredible. It's incredible for me to hear you say these things, because, I think for myself, there was a long time where I felt really alienated because I had intuited all of this stuff, and, people just thought you were crazy. And, it was something that I was really deeply invested in, so it was very alienating. And I'm sure there are tons of us out there around the world that are just sort of in disbelief, and also, feeling very empowered and excited about the potentials. It's really multi-level. So we have the, which is the healing of the trauma. But then, once you heal or bring the microcosmic, the individual system into homeostasis, that affects all the other systems in the universe, even from the point of view of physics. And so as we do this individual work and bring our own microcosm into homeostasis, we know, we have this like deep knowing that it is going to have effects even without direct causality. We don't have to even interact with other people. Just doing this work within ourselves, will have a mirror effect in other systems all throughout the universe. So I think that there are a lot of us, I'm sure the two of us and a lot of other people now, that are anticipating massive changes right in the nick of time as the world is descending into a chaostrophe, as Terence McKenna called it. And they called it well. I think that without this application of this medicine and the awareness that's developing of it, we really wouldn't stand a chance of reversing the trajectory. We're balanced on a precarious precipice, and all it would take at this point is a very small gust of wind, and it's a game over. The ecological destruction, the cultural, what would you call it? Just degradation in general. These things really do offer an answer, potentially. I think it's important that we be realistic. I saw an ad on Instagram the other day that said that if everyone would drink ayahuasca, there would never be another war. And I think that they may have missed that all of the ayahuasca drinking tribes, most of them were spearing each other, and still some of them are hostile. It's not necessarily an absolute cure-all for everything. And I think it's really important that we don't oversell the capacities or what these medicines actually do, because what they can do is so tremendous that that's enough. We don't need to add anything extraneous to it. One thing I wanted to ask you about, because it's something that I have not really been able to settle on or come to terms with myself, in regard to spirits. I have worked with several shamans that were really annoyed with me that I would not give objective reality to the existence of spirits in the way that they did. I do see the universe as an eternal sea of consciousness and awareness, but I'm not totally convinced that even like the DMT realm entities that have told me very specific, I don't want to call it prophetical stuff that actually came to pass exactly, just to the point where it's so difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Even given those things, it's still difficult for me to say, like, yes, these are beings with their own subjective identity. How do you relate to the idea of spirits?
Well, I think that the the idea of objectivity is a subjective idea. And so, the concept that like somehow my personal belief about what objective reality is, it defies the definition of objectivity because it's my belief, like I personally believe in this objective reality and someone else personally believes in a different objective reality. Therefore, I can't really say that there would ever be a way to determine what objective reality is. And I don't really think that it's that important. Science has always worked on models. If you went back 100 years, the idea of what objective reality was proven by science would be different than what objective reality is proven by science today. And so clearly in 100 years from now, objective reality will again be different in what has been proven by the same science. So I guess to me, it's more important about what models there are. But I think that you kind of hit the nail on the head. One, with like figuring out that I too also believe that consciousness is all that there is just monistic idealism in the sense that there is only consciousness. I do view frequencies of consciousness. So I think that once you get to a certain level of frequency, then there is a transformation, and we see that in our waking world with water. If you have it at a certain temperature, then it will freeze into a solid state. At a different range of temperature, it will be liquid, and then at a different range of temperature or frequency, it will be vapor. To me, that is very similar to consciousness in that my body is low frequency consciousness, my emotions are middle frequency consciousness, and my thoughts are high frequency consciousness that also refer to three states of mind: ideas, beliefs, and truths. What is true to me isn't true for everyone, because that is my solidification of a particular belief or idea in my consciousness. So if you're asking me personally, do I believe that spirits are real? 100%. That will never be changed because of my personal experiences with them. But does that make that true for someone else? No, of course not. And whatever model works for you or brings about the most benefit. I will also say that I believe that dreams are real. I have them all the time. I talk about them. Seems like everyone else has them. It's pretty much an objective reality that dreams are real. But most people think that dreams are not real. I think that thoughts are real. And I think, like I just said, that thoughts are made of the same material that chairs and books and boats and buildings are made out of exactly the same material, maybe organized at a different frequency level. So what are spirits? They're made out of the exact same material that I'm made out of. And if I think that I'm objectively real, which I do, then I also feel that spirits are objectively real. And I feel that DMT, spirit elves, or, whatever their Terrence McKenna name you want to put on them, something about machine elves or something, self-replicating machine elves. But, all of it, like, I think it's all real. Just as real as I think I am myself. And all of that, I acknowledge, is a subjective belief. So my subjective belief is my objective reality. How's that?
Yeah, well, and it's not about ontological position jockeying or something with that question. It's, one of the reasons I'm curious to sort of get it sorted. I mean, it's not that I don't believe that consciousness can sort of formulate itself and communicate with us. I just, I wonder things like, what the hell are the jesters that are flipping people off when they smoke DMT? What are they doing all day, all the time? What do they think they're doing? They're just always doing all these like random, nonsensical, weird. If they have their own awareness, what is their interpretation of what they're doing? Because it just makes no sense to us most of the time. And of course, that's not always the case. But the other element and the disturbing part of it, the more important facet of that question is that I think that there are a lot of toxic ideas in pop culture spirituality. And one of them is this idea of entities that are feeding on our positive energy. What I see in people that believe in that time and time and time again is the same set of psychological and emotional issues that very strongly suggest that this is not really negative entities. It is something that's being produced by their psychological and emotional disposition. That particular archetype is predisposed to believing in this delusion, and it is very escapist. It gives them the ability to sort of, give all the responsibility. Like, it's not even me, it's this other thing doing it. And I've just been running into that so much that, and sometimes I question myself, because it's generally what I tell people is that I don't really believe in negative entities. Partly because I think that chaos and evil is just a sort of incidental. It's just entropy and chaos, and it's symmetry and order and positivity that gives us the rest of it. And so, I have trouble believing in evil as an active force. So I was just curious what your perspective on that is, because I'm not entirely sure how to deal with it when I'm confronted with that. I mean, I always tell people to try banishing rituals or something of that nature. And I know also some tribes don't have language for negative spirits. Like, this is just not a thing in the world. So,
it's certainly a complex topic, to say the least. There were a couple things that you mentioned. One was the term empowerment, and I would say, like, if you're going to choose a model, choose one that is empowering, and I think that a lot of people end up choosing models that put themselves in a victim position, and they are detrimental to their well-being. And they then go on with a belief system that doesn't serve them. And I think that the use of psychedelics gives us an opportunity to get out of detrimental belief systems or programs, or at least to be able to see that we can have a different way of looking at things. For me, to maybe just give you the story that solidified my truth, but also the rationale behind the model and why I believe it benefits me. My third ceremony, I had a hand. I was in an ayahuasca ceremony. I knew where I was. I felt a hand on my shoulder. I looked over. It was the hand of a spirit, of a man who was standing next to me, looking down on me. I was sitting and he was standing. And I looked and I was like, I feel your hand touching me. Like, I'm looking at you. My eyes are open. Like, man, this is so real, And right at that moment, a friend of mine who was in the ceremony with me called out to me, Carlos, I'm looking over at you and it looks like there's a man standing next to you. And I was like, yeah, I know, I'm looking at him. And she was like, it's freaking me out. And I looked at his face. I could tell that he was kind the way he was looking at me. And I said, it's okay. He's a good guy. And she said, are you sure? I'm like, yeah, I am. At which point, what else am I supposed to think? Here's someone looking at the spirit that I'm looking at, that I can feel touching me. I don't know how much more validation do I need that this is real. So I put my hand out. I shook hands with him. He put his hand in my hand. I held it and shook hands with him. I asked him what his name was. He told me what his name was. As soon as he told me, I recognized him to be an important person from my youth. My godmother's son, which is kind of cool because maybe that means he's my god brother, even though that we don't have that term. And he was 10 years older than me. When I was a little kid, he took me fishing. Like I would spend the night at his house. We'd dig for worms. And in early mornings, we'd go together and spend this quiet time on a lake fishing together. Like he was an important person in my life, but he had committed suicide earlier that year. And now here was his spirit. I hadn't seen him in like 15 years. But when he said his name, I was able to recognize him at that point. And then I spoke with him. And, I can't say that I was thinking about him at all. As soon as he said his name, I quickly was like, oh yeah, my mom told me that you had committed suicide, I put the pieces together, but there was no concept that I conjured him or was thinking of him at all until he told me his name. And for me at that point, I became a believer, I guess. Like it went beyond belief. Like spirits were real at that point, and they never changed in my perception. But if you didn't have a story like that, then you probably wouldn't have the same effect or the same level of belief in the idea. But I also will say that believing in spirits is a benefit to me. Like I do feel like there are spirits that are helping me, that are guiding me. And I feel like by having that as a model, I believe in my own path forward more. I have more faith in my life and trust in the path that I'm following because I believe in spirits. Now, I also don't believe that there is such a thing as positive or negative or good or evil, other than, judgments on humans' behalf, like that we create good and evil and we impose it on things based on our own judgments. And oftentimes those are influenced heavily by conditioning. So one person could think that someone was evil and another person could think that same person was a saint. And maybe some of our saints were into some pretty fucked up shit, to be honest. So I don't really play that game, and I don't think it's healthy at all to play that game. It seems very ego-based, where you think that you're better than someone or you think someone is better than you, in terms of good and bad or good and evil. I'm not one that plays those games. And again, if in terms of entities, if somehow if a belief entity in entities is helping you, then maybe I would say go for it. I have never seen a situation where someone believed that they had an entity or believed that someone else had an entity and it helped them. But yeah. I could see that if you believed that you had an entity and also believed in and this is sometimes very real, that a different person could have a special ability to remove it. And they do, you go to a ceremony thinking that you have an entity, but you also go to the ceremony believing that the shaman has the ability to remove the entity. And then in the ceremony, you have an experience that you believe to be the removal of that entity. Then very, very quickly, you could be healed. And the next day, you never have that entity again, even though my perception would, based on what I've been talking about, would be that the change was actually in your consciousness. But regardless, that may be the steps necessary because of the, complicated collection of complexities in consciousness on your personal behalf that you needed in order to get to a point where you were healed. So, that's a whole nother can of worms, I guess, in the sense that we're always working with the system of beliefs and the truths that we carry. And sometimes you have to get super creative to work within those truths or within your belief system to achieve the goals that you hope to achieve. And I guess, when it comes to the New Age movement and those concepts, there's a lot of trouble, we're working with this Western paradigm, but trying to fit in this ancestral paradigm that has it's really operating on a foundation of a whole set of distinct truths and that we are not. and yet we're trying to like somehow fit in concepts into a different foundation, and it doesn't really work that well, or at least it's a very challenging endeavor. Yeah.
Well, it's funny, this thing about me and the entities, because I've never seen this entity. Well, actually, that's not true. I saw it in my mind's eye years before these other people saw it, but I didn't see it externally. And over the years, when I'm a guitarist, and the first time it was mentioned, I was practicing a lot, and my girlfriend just told me, sometimes I see this like purple, sort of demon-looking being behind you when you're playing. And I thought, well, that's cool. Satan's my spirit being or spirit animal or whatever, and I didn't really think much of it. And so then I was playing in a band, and the other guitarist one day said, man, I got to tell you something. Like 3 times now, I've seen this purple demon looking thing hovering behind you when you play the guitar. And of course, that's totally metal, so I was like, okay, that's cool, But then a 3rd time, this Maori kid, I was leaving a bar, and he said, hey, man, I got to tell you, so this thing, all these people saw it. And I'm like, and I think, one of the things that, and this goes right along with what you're saying, and this is kind of how I deal with it all, is just to say that I think acknowledging the sovereignty of the individual will, and just kind of negating any power. I mean, it didn't really matter to me, I guess, is what I'm saying. If there's some purple spirit following me around, it's not going to influence, if it even started talking to me, it's not going to influence how I behave, or, you know what I mean? Like I just wouldn't do that. And so eventually, though, ayahuasca did show me what it was. And it's one of the most extraordinary things that ever happened to me on ayahuasca. I was walking along, and suddenly that being that I had seen in my mind's eye was in front of me. And it was very beautiful, not demonic in like a dark way, but I think it did have horns, and that was the association. Other than that, though, it looked more like an ibex and a geisha or something, kind of hybridized. And she said, did you want to know what this is? And I realized that this is what the people had seen, and it was the one I'd had the visions of many years before. And I said, yes, I would like that very much. She said, well, it's you. But it's like the way that physicists say that one object can exist in 2 places simultaneously. This is you, but on a gas giant, in a different state of consciousness, not really a material form. This is the crazy part, though. She said it's a red dwarf that hasn't become, a gas giant that didn't become a red dwarf because of the influence of the other 2 stars. And then like 10 days after the ceremony, it occurred to me that I should look and see if there was any, astronomical data on this Sirius B and Sirius A, and it turns out that there actually is 2 stars that exerted the influence on a gas giant, and they've been observing the wobble for a long time, and they suspected that it was a tertiary system, but they weren't sure. And 5 days after the ceremony, they had discovered that this was actually true. So on top of this like weird insight into this like entity, I guess, I was given accurate information about a star system that no one knew at the time. So to relegate that to coincidence is, I mean, I guess I consider that as a possibility, but I mean, it was just like, how do you process something like that, And that night I had some friends in the teepee with me, and I talked about it, and one of them was with me when I found the paper online and stuff. So, I had all this confirmation, witnesses that were friends of mine that had seen the whole thing happen. So there was no getting away from it. That whatever that was had happened exactly in that way, And of course, one way to really easily kind of think about it is that if it's all consciousness, then we really do kind of have access to probably all of it under certain circumstances. And I think that one of the tricks of shamanism that the real masters learned, we hear from anthropologists from 200 years ago that they would, shamans would be able to describe the Eiffel Tower or a street corner in China, and there was no way they'd ever left the jungle. And so this ability to bring down the filters that create our illusory sense of an individual self and become part of the universal field of consciousness and extract actual relevant and real information from that field, I think that's it's a thing. It's part
the
of
definition of shamanism.
Yeah, and it's just crazy to see that it might even be limitless, you know. I actually saw an interview with Rolling Stone magazine with Jerry Garcia. Actually, they asked him, how did you guys play, 3,000 different songs and perform them differently every time? And he actually said to the interviewer, well, I've just taken enough LSD that the filters in my mind are just gone, and I can just kind of scroll through all the information in the universe like a giant filing cabinet and pick what I need, and it's just there for me. And in 1987, that was a crazy thing to say to Rolling Stone magazine, but I think it's true, and I think that idea of bringing down filters in the consciousness and having access to the mainframe, I guess, it's real and it's important, but it's also the reason why ideas like entities and stuff are kind of dangerous. I think it's very easy to get lost. You realize you have access to information through sort of unusual or non-traditional means. You have to be able to discern your wishful thinking from actual intuition, and you know what I mean, and to not become delusional. I think it's a very real danger. And so for some reason, I'm in Hawaii, Ecuador, in the middle of nowhere. But I would just assume that they have some kind of safety structure built into. I guess that's what integration is all about. Teaching people how to. It's like once you have opened the mind, and that's not like been a gradual process throughout your life, right? In our modern society, for a lot of these people, they're going from normal, just a normal person in a material world to suddenly having this like greater reality that they're just suddenly immersed in. And I would imagine that's difficult for a lot of people. But you guys do a lot of work to ensure that people can make that transition.
Oh man, I mean that's a real challenge too. I mean, it alludes to the same concept of paradigms, like those distinct paradigms. And I think that honestly, like the concept of entities is this carryover. It's like an idea from a paradigm that we do not operate in, but yet we've like tried to operate in it, probably because we've been exposed to it. So it's not uncommon that you would like go to a Shipibo curandero, for example, and they might say, oh, I'm going to remove a demon. They might use that language, and then you don't understand what that means. It doesn't really fit, but you like somehow imagine a place for it in your reality. And then you like carry this concept like, oh, there was like this demon in me, and then the shaman removed it. And now, your own imagination starts putting together this concept of entities and starting to look at other people as if they have demons or entities in them, and blah, 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 and it's so hard to try to understand any concept outside of your paradigm, because you'll always use the same references and truths and belief systems to interpret a concept that is foreign. And therefore, like, you'll never actually understand it, at least the way that it is understood within the paradigm where it exists. And, that's like the biggest challenge. And that's why I think like, if you are going to have ceremonies led by indigenous people from the Amazon, but visited or participated by people from outside of that paradigm or from the Western world, then you also need to have facilitators from that world working in collaboration that have experience and have studied that tradition as a way to translate and interpret the experiences into the proper language and understanding. And that would be like how I would view the integration process, because, there really isn't much of an integration process within the Shipibo tradition itself. But the Shipibo tradition itself, if you were Shipibo and you went to an ayahuasca ceremony, you're already operating in all of the same beliefs, so it's not, that to me is the real challenge of integration, is how do I put these new concepts, these new ideas that I've been exposed to into a reality that doesn't, cohabitate with them. And, ultimately a new paradigm has to be like formed. And that to me is like what we're headed towards, is this paradigm shift, or this new paradigm that has always like been in development. We're always like modifying our reality or our perception and conception of it. So this is just like a more dramatic step in that direction.
Yoda no ro no go yoda panai panayonta na na to yoda gira Bewa nyoba no ayahuasca bewa bo kepewo bewa shamangi Nesgadaigi nesgadaigi atoyora kira payam bogina atoyora gai Bewa medicina bewa kepewo bewa ato yora gida Shina yamawe masa shina yamawe miya benro abano Nesga shamangi mi yora abano mi yora abano poro sama meabi tseka boginda Yoda gidan, yoda vida gidan, nete yabi kepengi, mecan nete kepengi.